This is the Geforce 3060 Ti. It's claimed to be a bit faster than the Geforce 2080 Super, but for $399, a whole $100 cheaper than the next card up, the 3070. With the newest generation of graphics cards, like the Nvidia 3000 or AMD 6000 series, we've seen the fastest and most expensive cards first. These are always fascinating since they offer previously unseen levels of performance at equally high price points. But this leaves them out of reach of most people. That's why there are lower tiers like the 60 series from Nvidia, which generally becomes the mid-range card of choice for people wanting good gaming performance at a more attainable price. So I guess, if I had to define the 3060 Ti, it's the premium version of Nvidia's new mid-range offerings. It's a little unusual for it to come out before the version without the Ti bit at the end. In fact, the 3060 without the Ti isn't even a thing just yet. But Nvidia's choice to launch the 3060 Ti first is no surprise when we look at the situation Nvidia and AMD find themselves in right now. Neither company can keep up with the demand for their high-end cards. The moment they're in stock, they were immediately snapped up again. I've never seen anything like it. Since these are products they make the biggest profit margins on, and what with demand greatly outstripping supply, there's not much incentive for them to give buyers the option of a cheaper card just yet. So with that in mind, the fact that 3060 Ti is coming out tomorrow is a small miracle for consumers desperate for a new card but unable to get their hands on anything faster. And it sounds like these cards will be available in greater quantities than those above them, though whether that's enough to keep up with demand for them remains to be seen. So what's this card like? And who's it for? I'll be honest, I don't have access to the same hardware as a lot of reviewers out there do. I don't have a Geforce 2080 Super, which the 3060 Ti performs similarly to. Nor do I have a 2060 Super, the card it's going to replace in the price stack. So I'll be approaching this video as a series of questions you might have about it, which I can answer. First of all, I'll talk about the card itself. I like that it's physically smaller than the high-end cards. I have a few cases which struggle to fit in a 3080 sized card, but I'll have no problem with this one. I also like that Nvidia have used the same cooling system that they've used in their higher end designs. The end of this is all fan, so the card itself is even smaller than it looks here. And I love that, since it's rated for 200 watts, that it's got better power efficiency than the relative performance offered by the bigger 3080, and it only requires one 8-pin power connector to run it. Though, as you can see, it still uses that new power cable thing, which Nvidia seems to be pushing as the new standard on all of their 3000 series cards. Let's get on to performance. I first tried just testing the latest and most reflective titles I could find on the 3060 Ti. For some reason, neither Fraps, Frame Viewer, nor the built-in Nvidia frame rate counter showed up in these recordings, so you'll just have to go by my observations. Watch Dogs Legion is a demanding game, especially when driving about in the city. At 1440p ultra settings, the 3060 Ti averaged between 40 and 45 FPS. I then turned on ultra ray tracing and this sent it plummeting down to about 12 FPS. Completely unplayable. Using DLSS at balanced preset brought this right up to 40 to 45 FPS again. In other words, DLSS cancelled out the ray tracing hit entirely. That's with ultra settings. I dropped it all down to the very high quality preset and used the high ray tracing setting, and it ran between 35 and 45 FPS without DLSS being enabled. Enabling it sent this well above 60 FPS when on foot, and between 55 and 70 FPS when driving around. You can see the importance of DLSS in this title. It really is required for acceptable performance when ray tracing is enabled. If every game supported DLSS, then this wouldn't be a problem, but only a select few titles have it for now. Luckily, these tend to be the games with ray tracing, and they need it the most. The other game I tested was Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. I maxed out all of the settings in this game, plus the high resolution texture pack, plus ray tracing all ramped up to maximum settings. And this game ran consistently around the 60 to 70 FPS mark for the majority of the time. It dropped to the 40s for a few seconds when I was running up some stairs, then was nearer to 90 FPS when on the rooftops. Switching on DLSS on balanced setting and the average shot up to the 90s. It was extremely smooth and playable. I'm happy to report that this game ran well without DLSS, and very well with it. Comparing the 3060 Ti with Nvidia's current gaming flagship, you give up some performance. In the titles I tested, it was on average 82% the speed of the 3080 at 1440p, 70% at 4K, and 65% of the speed when ray tracing was enabled. Considering the 3060 Ti only has 56% of the ray tracing cores that the 3080 has, it's actually outperforming how it should be faring, given its specs. I'm expecting there to be some CPU bottlenecking going on at lower resolution, so I feel like the 65 to 70% figure is more representative of this card's speed compared to the 3080. The The resulting frame rate difference will be most felt at higher resolutions. At 4K, the 3060 Ti more often than not came below 60 FPS, while the 3080's extra power was enough to keep it above that magical figure. But at 1440p, unless you're using absolute ultra settings, both cards can deliver beautifully smooth performance in the latest titles. It's just in next year's games and beyond where having cards above the 3060 Ti will begin to pay off. In my main rig, I've gone from a 3080 to a 3060 Ti and have been using only that for the last few weeks. In the games I've been playing, I've hardly noticed any difference, outside of benchmarks designed to test the card. It's just that right now there are so few games that will challenge this tier of performance. The hits seem to be a bit greater in ray-traced situations. For example, it was only 63% of the speed of the 3080 in the Quake 2 RTX demo. This example stood out to me as being one of the games currently available where the speed differences between these cards can be felt at 1440p. Using default settings, the 3080 averaged 78 FPS, while the 3060 Ti's 49 didn't feel quite so fluid, or my mouse movements quite as responsive. The Quake 2 test is interesting because it's one of the few fully ray-traced games out there right now. Most, like Watch Dogs or Call of Duty, only ray-trace certain elements on the screen, and so the performance impact tends to be lesser in those titles. The 3060 Ti had no problem powering the newest Call of Duty at ultra settings at 1440p, for instance, and Watch Dogs is probably a bad example because it runs poorly even without ray-tracing. But the Quake 2 demo does show that this card might not have the power required to fully ray-trace scenes at this resolution, and may instead need to rely on upscaling like DLSS to hit the 60 FPS mark. Running Quake 2 at 75% resolution scaling, which is 1080p upscale to 1440p, brought the average up to 80 FPS while still looking clear and detailed. In short, on average it's 70% of the 3080's performance at 57% of the price. Although faster than the 2080 Super, the 3060 Ti can't beat the 2080 Ti for performance, which was Nvidia's flagship card until the 3000 series came out. In my testing, it was 93% of the 2080 Ti's performance at 1440p, 88% at 4K, and 89% when ray tracing and/or DLSS was enabled. Bear with me for a second while I nerd out by discussing the inner workings of these cards. You shouldn't care much about this, it is, after all, the resulting card that matters. But it is still interesting to compare a big 2000 series card with a cut-down 3000 series one like this one. These two generations aren't directly comparable, they're based on different architectures which behave very differently. For instance, on paper the 3060 Ti actually has more CUDA cores than the 2080 Ti does, but has far fewer tensor cores, RT cores, and texture units. The result of this change is what matters though, and the 3060 Ti manages 90% of the performance at 80% of the power draw, and is being sold for 40% of the price. However it's managed to achieve it, Ampere does offer improved efficiency per frame generated. And even more importantly than that, people in the market for a graphics card today will get more performance for their money than they would have done a few years ago. The 3080 was already faster than the 2080 Ti, but its lead grew further when ray tracing was enabled, possibly thanks to the new and improved RT cores seen in the 3000 series. But this advantage doesn't carry across to the 3060 Ti. Its ray tracing performance remains constant with the other results compared to the 2080 Ti, suggesting that whatever improvements have been made to Ampere's cores have been cancelled out by the vastly cut down number of them seen in this card. I guess it's a shame. But the fact still stands that this card delivers 90% of the 2080 Ti's performance regardless of what you throw at it, apart from Port Royale, which it didn't seem to like much at all. I'm not too surprised to see that the 2080 Ti is faster. In the new lineup is the 3070 that matches it, though that card costs $100 more than the 3060 Ti, so you've got to decide whether it's worth spending 20% more to close the gap that you see here. So far, I've only compared the 3060 Ti to cards faster than itself. It's fun to do that, but the people getting the 3060 Ti will be doing so because they're on something slower than it right now. So I went about and tested the older cards I found lying about in my room to see what sort of jump up in performance the 3060 Ti could deliver. The oldest of the cards is the Geforce 970, 4GB. This is over 6 years old now. If you had got one of these new, it would have delivered incredible performance for years. It was based on a new, super efficient architecture, could shallow play record up to 4K, and wasn't much slower than the much more expensive 980. Every time I mention this card, people quickly point out that it's only 3.5GB plus half a gigabyte, which I'll reply with, that makes 4. Unsurprisingly, the 3060 Ti proves to be a massive jump up from this card. In Time Spy, the 3060 Ti is almost 3 times faster, and in the Superposition benchmark, almost 4 times faster than the Geforce 970. The 970 limped along in the 1440p benchmark results. It could still achieve 60 FPS in Rainbow Six Siege at max settings, native 1440p, and Troy Total War at high preset was also very playable. But in the rest of the titles, it's clear the 970 no longer has what it takes at this resolution. It would take a cruel person with a cold heart to push this card any further than 1440p. Next up, the 4K results, and this is where the 970 finally gives up. It simply didn't have the RAM to even enable Red Dead 2 at this resolution, and it started underperforming in other games as well. To all those people who said that its 3.5GB of VRAM wasn't enough, I finally agree with you. It isn't at 4K 6 years after the card came out. If you're still on this card, then the 3060 Ti will be a great jump up for you. Although you kind of hope for this, what with the 970 being a $330 card from 2014 and the 3060 Ti being a $400 card from 2020. The next card I tested was the Radeon 480 with 8GB of VRAM. This was the first VR-ready GPU to be under $200, though admittedly the 8GB version cost $40 more. This was Polaris' debut and remained AMD's shining star for years, returning again to power the 500 series and proving to be a remarkably powerful mining card. At one point this thing would have been worth several times its original $200 asking price. Those who didn't have it wished they had one, and those who did have it wished they had bought two, since otherwise if they sold that they'd be left without a graphics card and nothing around this time was particularly cheap. I've kept the 970's results in here for reference. I know this video is about the 3060 Ti, but I'm actually more interested in comparing the 970 with the 480 here. At 1440p, it either manages the same performance as the 970 or substantially more, even pushing into playable frame rates in Assassin's Creed and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the 970's results are more questionable. And 4K stretches the 480's advantage even further still. Probably thanks to its 8GB of VRAM, it was able to run Red Dead 2, and didn't fail horribly in Wolfenstein either. It even manages to be more than half the speed of the Geforce 3060 Ti in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It seems like it's a game that favours AMD hardware more than Nvidia's, but still, on average, the Radeon 480 8GB is just 37% of the speed of the 3060 Ti. But it's worth remembering that we're comparing a $240 GPU from 2016 with a $400 GPU from 2020 here. The next card is an interesting one. It's the Vega 56. This was intended to be the high-end part of AMD's lineup, positioned above the Radeon 480. It sounded great on paper with its 8GB of next-generation HBM memory and stuff, but it wasn't power efficient and it came out a year later than it should have done to be a proper competitor to the 1000 series. Still, it was fast enough to do what it needed to do, and later became a great value card for 1440p gaming, and is still powering AMD's APUs to this day. There's more I'd like to say about this card, but let's just move on to the results. In TimeSpy, it manages to be 57% of the speed of the Geforce 3060 Ti, which is an excellent result for the AMD card. It doesn't do so well in the Superposition benchmark at 1080p extreme settings though, falling well behind the 3060 Ti and managing just 3 FPS more than the 4080 did. Vega just seems really bad in Superposition for some reason. The 1440p results were where the Vega 56 was strongest, scoring as high as 69%, and averaging 58% the speed of the 3060 Ti. But that difference still matters. The 3060 Ti's extra power allowed it to achieve smooth performance when Vega's was choppy, or to break through to triple digits while Vega's was still not much over 60. And for some reason, the Vega didn't do well at 4K at all, often not doing much better than the much less powerful Radeon 480 did. If I look at all of the results, the Geforce 3060 Ti ends up being about twice the speed of the Vega 56, often being as fast at 4K as the Vega 56 is at 1440p. And last, I tested the Geforce 1660 Super. This is the most recent of the budget cards I'm testing. It only came out late last year and represents the fastest card Nvidia currently sells before you need to move up to its RTX lineup. It's a bit slower than the 2060 series, but I can imagine that some people may have opted for a 1660 as they waited for the Raytracing technology to mature somewhat. So perhaps that's why people might be interested in moving from a 1660 to a 3060 tier of card. Its results were very similar to the Vega 56's. It wasn't quite as fast as the Vega card at 1440p, but beat it at 4K, which is really strange since it only has 6GB of VRAM compared with Vega's 8. On average, the 1660 Super proved to be about half the speed of the Geforce 3060 Ti. Not a bad leap up for a single generation. Or is it two? It gets confusing with Nvidia's 1600 series. On to the conclusion. There are two ways to see the Geforce 3060 Ti. The first is to compare it with the other new Nvidia and AMD cards, and that makes the 3060 Ti an attractive proposition. It contains all of the same features for a lot less money. It's the price versus performance king right now. If you're looking for a new card and simply must have it before Cyberpunk comes out, then yes, this is a great card to get for ray tracing. But do be warned that it's going to be about 10% slower than the 3070, which is the card that's recommended for playing Cyberpunk at 1440p with ray tracing on ultra settings. Still, when looking at the performance, the 3060 Ti has got more overhead at 1440p than the 3080 does at 4K. The second way to look at the 3060 Ti is to compare it with older cards. If you're still on a Geforce 970 or Radeon 480, or I'm guessing a Geforce 1060, which would perform similarly to those, then the 3060 Ti will deliver about 3 times more performance, meaning you can go up a resolution, switch on some ray tracing effects, and still have enough horsepower to enjoy faster frame rates as well. If you're sitting on a more powerful older card like the Vega 56, 5600 XT or Geforce 1070 or 1660, the 3060 Ti will still deliver roughly double the performance, depending on the game and resolution. That's a good jump up, one that you definitely notice and appreciate. But you might question whether you were hoping for more from a $400 graphics card, especially when it's cost you more than the one you're currently on, and have been on for several years already. I think whether or not the 3060 Ti is worth it will depend on how interested you are in ray tracing, because if you are, then it's a good card with enough power to do it justice, especially in conjunction with DLSS. The reason I'm mentioning prices so much is because we're in a strange time for computer hardware. Progress has slowed down for the past few years. Something tells me it's picking up again now, but if you've been a PC gamer recently, the chances are you've been using the same hardware for longer than you've ever done before, because graphics cards from several years ago can still drive today's games, if at lower resolutions and without ray tracing. And now's an interesting time for cards with 8GB of VRAM. 5 years ago, when the Radeon 390 series came out with that amount, I saw it as overkill. Then with the Vega and Geforce 1000 series, 8GB started to feel like a sensible amount for the high-end to have. And now we're beginning to see the transition away from 8 and towards greater amounts in the high end, like 10GB for the 3080 and 16 for the RX 6800 series. But this is still only reserved for the super high end for now. So when it comes to the 3060 Ti's 8GB of the stuff, I still think it's an acceptable amount for a card of this tier. Remember, the 2060 only had 6 when it first came out, so having 8 is, at worst, a sideways move from last generation's 2060 Super. There has definitely been a price creep going on. The 3060 Ti at $400 is the joint most expensive 60 tier of card that we've ever seen, sharing the honour with that 2060 Super from last generation. Before then, the $400 price point would have got you a 70 tier of card, like the Geforce 1070, and before that the Geforce 970, which was just $330. We're now paying more for a 60 tier of card than we used to for a 70 tier. The one silver lining is that, while it's $400 for a 60 tier of card, it is still the Ti variant, a premium 60 series, implying that a cheaper vanilla 3060 will come out at some point later on. I await that card's price and performance with great interest. For now, ignoring how prices might have inflated, the 3060 Ti marks the premium mid-range segment. It can drive modern games at 1440p with ray tracing performance that's 90% as fast as the previous generation's flagship. It's twice as fast as last generation's mid-range cards, and 3 times as fast as $250 cards from 4 years ago. So there you have it, the Geforce 3060 Ti. A big step up from older cards, a smaller step down from newer ones, and the first of the new generation to be less than $400.